Hey, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to True Crime Wednesday. Over here. I always get, everything's backwards from what I see, and it always throws me off. So, welcome to True Crime Wednesday. My name's Lori Hellis, and I am a retired criminal attorney writing the definitive book on the Daybell case. And welcome to the place where we talk about all things true crime. Of course, we are going to focus tonight on Daybell because the trial is going on, and I'm in Boise, Idaho, and attending the trial and wrapping up the last of the updates on the book. But there are a few other cases that I wanted to talk about before we get started. There have been just things popping all day long in the true crime world. Not necessarily major bombshells, but just a lot of things. So I wanted to run through these kind of quickly. In the Madeline Soto case, you recall Madeline Soto was a 13-year-old girl whose body was recovered in Florida after having gone missing. Her stepfather, when his telephone was searched, it revealed that he had had some highly inappropriate contact with my little hanger thing is hanging out here. He had had some very inappropriate contact with little Madeline going on for many years, and lots of people were interested in the fact that he had been charged with the SA in her case, but had not been charged with her murder. Well, the grand jury in Florida indicted him today on murder charges for the murder of Madeline Soto. So that was good news. Also, in the Kansas missing mom trial, that was a trial where a mom and two moms, but one of them was her friend who was accompanying her. She was her pastor's wife, was accompanying her as a supervisor for a child custody exchange. The two women disappeared in Kansas and were found a couple of days later. 4 people were indicted on kidnapping and murder, and now a 5th person whose name is Grice, Paul Grice, has been indicted. The Karen Reed trial is underway, and that's sort of interesting. They have been picking a jury for the better part of a week. The court has decided that they want at least 20 jurors to be qualified because they are concerned that they may lose some jurors because of juror hardship. The defense in that case also filed a motion complaining about how the courtroom has been configured and complaining about the fact that at least half of the jurors are unable to see the witnesses while they are testifying. So there are still some things up in the air about getting that trial underway, but it's expected that it will start on Monday. And then a couple of other minor, nothing's minor in this case, but a small thing going on in Delphi. You may remember that the defense has made a motion to dismiss they filed a motion to suppress, let's get the right terminology here, filed a motion to suppress Richard Allen's confession. That is because they say that his confession was coerced by the fact that he was being threatened and he was being abused while he was in prison. And the prosecution has now filed their response, and we will wait to see what is going to happen. Unfortunately, the judge has banned cameras in that courtroom. It is so unfortunate because there are so many questions about what is going on in that case. So many questions about the bias that the judge may or may not have. And so it's very troubling to see that that the, that case is not going to be more transparent. I'm happy to report that Bob Mata from Defense Diaries lives in neighboring Illinois, and I think he intends to attend the trial and then do live broadcasts afterwards. So we are going to have boots and eyes on the ground there, but it's very disheartening that that judge is not being more transparent. I don't think it's a big surprise because she has definitely not been transparent and has definitely not has certainly allowed her bias to get the better of her. But unfortunately, we're not going to be able to see that trial. So I am hoping that Bob Mata, we're going to be relying on Bob Mata to be our ears and eyes on the ground there. So let's chat about Vallow Daybell. We have seen a lot of witnesses, and I think the prosecution might, just my overall impression is I think the prosecution feels like this is going quicker than they had anticipated. At one point, the judge called a lunch recess early because the prosecution had gotten through their witnesses quicker than they believed they would. And I think that has kind of been a hallmark going forward. I think there have been occasions where we have seen prosecution witnesses sort of buzz through quicker. We've also seen in probably 5 or 6 different witnesses instances where John Pryor has said he also had that witness under subpoena and has released them because he was able to cover everything that he needed to in his cross-examination. So I do want to talk a bit. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the recording that we saw of Chad and Emma while Chad was in the backseat of the police car. Quite a few folks have commented in surprise that that Emma appeared to be in contact with Lori Vallow, and that is accurate. And in fact, Emma, some of her comments, early comments about Lori Vallow were how lovely it was that she was there and helping her family heal from the loss of her mother, that she commented that Lori Vallow was a family friend that her dad had gotten together with after her mother died. And it's very clear from the conversation she has with her dad while he's in the back of the police car. He goes through his wallet, and one of the things he gives her is the information on how to access his Tellmate account. And that is to be able to put money on Lori's books and to have conversations with Lori. And Emma said to him, I don't need that because I already have my own Tellmate account because I've already been talking to Lori. So we don't really know what the relationship was between Emma and Lori, but it doesn't appear that it was an unfriendly or hostile relationship. Kind of surprising if your mother has just died and 17 days later, your dad marries this blonde bombshell on the beach. So it's a bit surprising that they are, at least Emma had been so accepting of Lori so early on. On the day of Tammy's funeral in Rexburg. Now, Chad Daybell wasted absolutely no time in getting Tammy Daybell in the ground. within 48 hours of her death, he had had her embalmed and transported to to Springville, Utah, and buried. So it was a very quick turnaround, and that was all done really fast. And then the family all came back to Rexburg for a separate memorial service for the people in Rexburg. After that memorial service, so we're talking 4 days at the most after Tammy's death, after that memorial service, Lori invited Chad and all of his kids over to her place for cookies after the memorial service. So in some ways, that may have been Chad's children's first introduction to Lori, but just a few days later, they got married on the beach. So Emma, at that point, when Chad is arrested in June, the kids' bodies are found. Lori's been in jail since early March in Rexburg, and Emma somehow has been talking to Lori while she's in jail, because she says she starts saying things about knowing how to get things to people by having Amazon, buying it on Amazon and having Amazon deliver it. She knows about how to put money on Lori's books. So it's very clear that she has some understanding of what Lori's situation is and what the rules are in jail. I had a question tonight, totally off topic. I'm looking at my notes here. I had a question from a viewer who is in Europe and wants to know when the book is going to be available in Europe. So I just want you to know I got that question and I'm going to look into it. I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm going to double check. So I will answer that question as we go forward. So during that conversation that Chad had with Emma, it was also very clear that he looked to her as sort of the de facto leader of the family when he wasn't available, and was handing off to her information about handing off to her financial decisions and how to go about taking care of Chad's bills and all of his financial transactions now that he wasn't going to be available to do it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Melanie Gibb's testimony because there were some questions about her, and there were some discussions with John Pryor that I thought were kind of interesting. For the most part, having heard Melanie Gibb already testify twice, she's testified under oath once at Chad's preliminary hearing, once at Lori's trial, and she's also gave a lengthy interview to Nate Eaton prior to any of those appearances. So it was sort of interesting to look back, but I didn't find that there were that many places where there were discrepancies between her former testimony or where new things came up that we hadn't heard before. Pretty much everything that we had heard from Melanie Gibb, we'd heard before. John Pryor asked Melanie Gibb and then later asked David Warwick about a group called Seven Gatherers. We don't know what this is about. I am assuming that we're going to hear much more about this once John Pryor's case in chief starts, once the defense starts putting on their case. But right now, he's asked twice. Now, I did a quick Google search and I came up with nothing having to do with Seven Gatherers. So you have to wonder whether this was something in their internal group. You have to sort of wonder whether or not that was a reference to 7 people who were in the inner circle. it doesn't appear to me that it has anything to do with the greater um, LDS fundamentalist kind of movement, the greater LDS or doomsday movement, at least not that I could find any reference to. So if anybody finds a reference to seven gatherers, please reach out to me and let me know, because it's not something I came across. It's not something I came across in any of the literature that I've read about the LDS Church. Sorry, my allergies are going wild. And before y'all send me remedies, I am double medicated on all kinds of antihistamines, and it is still really bad. Everything here in Idaho, we've had 3 or 4 really nice days where it's been really sunny and it's been in the 70s in the afternoons. And of course, everything is exploding in bloom. And so it is all just hitting me hard. So that scratch you hear in my voice, that's thank you to the pollen count, which according to the local news is in the extreme category right now. And I just happen to be very, very susceptible to spring allergies. I have year-round allergies, but they're definitely worse this time of year. So if I get a little froggy, that's the reason why. There were a couple of things that I thought were interesting. When one of the law enforcement, and I'd have to go back through my notes and look up which one it was. One of the law enforcement agents was talking about the fact that Lori and Chad had been sealed, that they sealed themselves to each other in the Mesa Temple. And there was a point that I wanted to make that I thought was a point where there was some disagreement. Now, what we know is that Lori and Chad met in October of 2018 at the Preparing a People conference in St. George, Utah. 2 weeks later, after that initial meeting, and they had this immediate spark. 2 weeks later, Chad was scheduled to go to Mesa, Arizona, which is just next door to Chandler and Gilbert, where Lori lived with Charles and where Brandon Boudreaux lived. They're just neighboring suburbs in the greater Phoenix area. So the temple in the Phoenix area is in Mesa. So Chad was going to Preparing a People conference in Mesa. And Lori invited him, along with several other people, to stay at her house while they were in town for the Preparing a People conference. Conveniently, Chad Daybell was out of town that weekend. So Lori invited all these folks to come and stay at her house. While Chad was there at the Preparing a People conference, Lori and Chad were very cozy. Chad stayed at Lori's house. They took walks together holding hands, and that was the point that they decided to get burner phones so they could continue to communicate. So Lori and Chad went to the Mesa Temple, and this is recounted both in an email which turned out to have been sent by Melanie Gibb, and which years ago was posted on Reddit, where she talked about the things Lori had told her. And it's also recounted in his James and Elena Loinfire story series of texts, that he and Lori went to the Mesa Temple, and he, going rogue, claiming that because he had the priesthood, he was authorized to marry them, to seal them in the temple. And LDS believe that if you are sealed in the temple, you are sealed married to your partner, not only for your life till death do us part, but they also believe that you are sealed to your partner for time and eternity, which means that you will be together in the afterlife as husband and wife. So they went to the temple, and Chad said that what Melanie said was that they were reaffirming, they were resealed to each other in the Mesa Temple. Because Chad claimed that they had previously been sealed to one another as far back as the James and Elena story, which is the time of Jesus. So interestingly enough, the law enforcement officer who talked about that same sealing talked about it in terms of a proxy sealing. So the LDS Church also believes that if people, now, because they believe that you must be married in order to make it into the highest, into the celestial kingdom, you must be married. That's an LDS ordinance. You have to be married in order to make it into heaven. Because they believe that, they also believe in what are called proxy sealings, just like they do for baptisms. They believe you have to be baptized and married. And so in the LDS faith, what would happen is, this is one of the reasons why LDS folks do so much genealogy work, because they believe that if you have an ancestor who died in an unmarried or unbaptized state, people can go into the temple and stand in for them and be baptized or sealed by proxy. So sometimes what happens is you will identify two people who died unmarried, and you will have people go into the temple and then do a proxy wedding for them. Now, there's nothing in what we know about Chad and Lori's activity in the Mesa Temple that suggests that that sealing was a proxy sealing for somebody else, for an ancestor. There's nothing that suggests that it was a proxy sealing for James and Elena. It was Chad and Lori resealing themselves to one another for time and eternity, even though they were still married to other partners. So that's really different. It's particularly strange because, as far as I know, Lori and Charles were not married in the temple. They were not sealed in the temple. But we know that Chad and Tammy were sealed in the temple, in the Manti Temple, when they were married, when they were first married. But it's important to note that in the LDS faith, they do believe in polygamy in the celestial kingdom. So it is possible for an LDS man to be married to more than one woman in the celestial kingdom. It is not that way for women, but it is for men. So, so they were resealed. Now, Melanie Gibb did talk more about castings, and she did make the comment that sometimes Chad was present when those castings were done. Melanie Gibb tried very hard to distance herself a bit from all the other people who were involved, from Lori and from her friends. So there were several instances where she would say, well, Lori and her friends would get together and do a casting, meaning Zulema, Christina, Nicole, Serena, the little group of people that Lori would gather to do these castings. But it was very clear Melanie Gibb was involved, and John Pryor brought that out. Sometimes Chad was present. But Melanie made a real concerted effort to sort of minimize her involvement and distance herself from the goings on, the castings. Now, I will say um, that I thought it was interesting that at one point Melanie Gibb said, um, somebody, one of the two asked her about why it was, first of all, they asked whether or not Lori had talked to, um, let me get this right, whether or not Melanie and Lori had talked about Chad, about divorce, about whether either one of them were going to get divorced. Now, by this time, Charles had already filed for divorce from Lori. And but Melanie said when she asked Lori Vallow about why Chad didn't get a divorce, Lori said it was because Chad would be in trouble with Jesus and would lose his exaltation if he got divorced. So he couldn't get divorced because he would no longer be an exalted or translated being if he did that. He'd be get in trouble with Jesus. Lori, so Melanie then asked Lori, well, what about you being, y'all are both still married? And Lori told her that each time that she met up with Chad, and it appeared that they met in hotels and they were trying to get together as often as they could, sometimes a couple of times a month if Chad could swing some invitations somewhere to meet up. Um, and Lori said that it was okay that she was meeting up with Chad because every time she was going to meet up with Chad, she would ask Jesus if it was okay first. And Jesus was telling her it was okay for her to meet up with Chad, even though they were both still married. Melanie also said that when Lori Vallow told her that she was going to be moving to Rexburg, she was very clear that it was because she was ready to start her mission with Chad, even though Tammy Daybell was still very much alive in August of 2019. So I think one of the interesting things is that John Pryor keeps going after Melanie Gibb. He is, regardless of which witness he is talking about, he is asking about Melanie Gibb. He's asking about Melanie Gibb's involvement. He really is attempting to cast Melanie as more having a much larger involvement, and particularly on the night that JJ died. And I guess that's thoroughly understandable. If I were in John Pryor's shoes, I'm sure I would be doing the same thing because I would be pointing the finger at the other two adults that were in the house the night that JJ died. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. And I certainly think that John Pryor is going to continue to try and focus attention, muddy the waters by focusing the attention on Melanie and David Warwick. I have seen a number of many comments about John Pryor and his style. I want to be clear, John Pryor is doing a really good job, but his style is not my style. And I would not have gone that hard against some of those witnesses. And it doesn't really have anything to do with the strength or the relative strength of the case, or whether or not you think that Chad Daybell is guilty. But it has to do with not wanting to alienate the jury. And I think that John Pryor has been walking a tightrope when it comes to that. And I'm not sure that he's 100% on the right side of the tightrope right now. I think he's running the risk of this very confrontational, bombastic, raising his voice sort of questioning. I think he's running the risk of that backfiring with the jury. Now, I think the jury has been with him keeping up with him when it comes to poking holes in the credibility of some of these witnesses and asking the jury, don't you think this seems a little odd? Don't you think that's strange? Doesn't that raise some questions in your mind about, about what these two adults were doing in the house when this child was murdered, and somebody woke up in the middle of the night and went to talk to Lori, and Lori's door was locked, and Lori didn't come out, and Lori didn't respond. It's not like they went to sleep and they slept 8 hours, and when they woke up in the morning, Lori was up and told them Alex had already come to get JJ. That's not exactly what happened, because they were awake in the night, and something odd was going on in the household. So I can see John Pryor really going after that. But I don't think that in order to do that, you have to have that hyper masculine, confrontational kind of a persona to do that. Now, I understand that that is Pryor's, that's his approach. I think that an attorney, a smart attorney, measures their presentation for that case. You tailor your presentation and the way that you appear to that case. And I think that you have to sort of observe and take the temperature of the jury. I'm not sure that John Pryor's doing that, and I worry. Because, first of all, I think this is a very different jury than Lori Vallow's was. I look over at them and I don't see the level of emotion on their faces that we saw in Lori Vallow's case. Now, we have not seen yet, we've seen some pictures. Now, they're not being live streamed at all. In Lori's trial, some of those more graphic photos were shared publicly with the people who were in the courtroom. There was an autopsy photo of JJ shown. We did see the autopsy photos of Tammy Daybell. We did see some photos of Tylee's remains. The more graphic photos were not shown, and they were only shown to the jury, and they were not projected on the screen, and they were not on screens that the gallery could see. But we did see some of those. They are not being shown at all in this case. It's very clear that they do not want them streamed publicly. And I understand that. I understand that even if the photos are, and I agree actually, I understand that even if the photos are not super graphic, they do still end up being out on the internet for everyone to see and share in ways that they weren't in Lori Vallow's trial. And I agree with that. I don't think that any of the family members of the victims really want to see those photos out in the public domain forever. And so I agree that there's no real reason to live stream those more graphic photos. And I think that probably was a wise decision on the court's part. So what that has meant for this trial is that we're not seeing as many of those really different. We're not able to see the photo and judge the jury's reaction. So that is the issue that it's a little bit harder to judge the jurors' reactions. as far as I can tell, knowing what the public saw in Lori Vallow's trial, it doesn't appear that we've had as much of the really graphic stuff yet. We have not seen the FBI's analysis of the tool marks on Tylee's bones. We have not seen a lot of those kinds of images. We also have not heard from the medical examiner who performed the autopsy, from any of the medical examiners, from the ME for Tammy or the ME for Tylee and JJ. So we haven't heard those descriptions or gotten those more graphic photos. So it is a little hard to judge, but I will say that in Lori's trial, when the evidence came out about Charles Vallow and about his murder, the jury was stunned. They were aghast, and you could see on their faces they were shocked. When some of the images began to be shown of Tammy and of JJ, you could see many of the jurors with their arms folded and just glaring at Lori. We have not seen that with this jury. Now, I have not been in court every day. I've been sort of alternating going to the courthouse and then being at home. Part of it is because my house is being shown, and there are times I just can't get back from court in time to make sure that things are ready for house showing. So, but when I have been there, I have paid very close attention to the jury, and they are a very different jury. They are much more reserved, much more, I want to say, I mean, I don't want to say professional, but I want to say that they are much less overtly reactive. And we're not seeing that. I have not seen members of the jury in tears, which we did see in Lori's trial. Now, we may very well see that when some of the more explicit photos having to do with the children are shown. I don't know that there can really be a dry eye in the house when you're talking about the murder of children. However, I have seen much less of them being very reactive. And I guess that sort of, as a defense attorney, you have to be able to gauge, take the temperature of the room. You've got to be able to read the room. And it doesn't seem to me like John Pryor is reading the room. I think he is just charging forward with his case and his kind of bombastic style without really any consideration of the mood of the courtroom. And I think you do that at your peril. So I'm a little worried about how that more confrontational style is being received by the jury. I think this is a jury who is less maybe moved by theatrics. And the other thing is that the prosecution has been so non-theatrical, has been so almost deadpan. I mean, they are so, everything is just right down. And I think because of that, the contrast is more noticeable. It's more noticeable that there's this contrast in the way that they're being presented with the evidence. On one hand, they have this very straightforward, quite professional, very measured prosecution, and then they have this guy on the other end that when he really moves in to really strike a point, he's he's up here and he's yelling. And I think that that the contrast is worrisome for me, because I think the jury is going to think, if he has to put on this big a show, what's he trying to hide behind all that smoke and mirrors? And that, I think, is concerning. It's certainly not the way that I would go about doing a cross-examination. I am much more about pointing out the discrepancies, kind of like Chinese water torture, sort of tick, tick, tick. Small thing, small thing, small thing, small thing. Well, doesn't that mean this? And you've taken your witness one little step at a time, and they've agreed to, yes, that's right, yes, that's right, yes, that's right. Then you say, well, if all of those other things are true, then doesn't that mean this? And you've literally painted them, they've painted themselves into a corner. So that is much more likely the way I like to do cross-examination, is to be very measured and very specific about this fact, this fact, this fact. And some of the things that John Pryor is going after, I realize that he has a limited scope, a limited number of things that he can raise in order to raise reasonable doubt. But one of the things he keeps going after is that Tammy Daybell didn't like to go to the doctor. Tammy Daybell wanted to use natural remedies. And so a couple of the law enforcement officers that were on the stand today were people who responded when Tammy Daybell, they responded to the call for that Tammy had died. So there were a couple of those. Brenda Dye was on the stand for a long time, and John Pryor really went after her. And I thought that in doing so, he opened the door for her to say, I am not the medical examiner, and opened the door to give much more credence to the medical examiner's testimony when it comes along. So he really went after Brenda Dye. One of the things he said was, you saw all of these herbal remedies and all of these things that Tammy was taking, didn't you? Yes. Well, you don't know what the impact could have been of any of those things. That's correct. But then the prosecution came back and said, you don't know but how many, if any, of those herbal remedies that she was taking at the time she died, do you? No. And then, of course, we're going to hear from the toxicology reports that are going to say, we didn't find anything of any import in the tox screens that they did. So I think that there were ways that John Pryor could have brought that out in a much more effective way without cracking the door to give the medical examiner even more credibility when that comes up. So one of the things that about cross-examination is it's like a chess game, because not only do you want to get in the evidence that pokes holes or shows the deficiencies in the state's case, but you want to tee it up for future witnesses as well. And I think that John Pryor hasn't been great about teeing up what other witnesses might be coming down the pike. So David Warwick was on the stand for quite a while. He is was Melanie Gibb's boyfriend at the time, now husband. A lot has been made of the fact that he and Melanie Gibb have been married for almost 3 years, but have only spent have only lived together about 9 months out of that time. Otherwise, she lives in Arizona and he lives in Utah. And I thought it was really interesting that John Pryor jumped to the conclusion that they had only gotten married so that they couldn't be called to testify against one another, which I thought was fascinating. Now, the prosecution brought up the point that neither one of them have been charged in anything, and neither one of them are under suspicion, so it would be sort of silly to get married so that you didn't have to testify against one another in a case where you're not under suspicion. But John Pryor is continuing to go after Melanie and David Warwick. David Warwick did say something that got my antenna up, and it may have absolutely, it does have absolutely nothing to do with this case. But here I thought was interesting. He said he first met Chad Daybell sometime face-to-face in 2015. But that prior to that, Chad had reached out to him on multiple occasions asking him to write a book that Chad would publish. And David Warwick had said no, he wasn't interested in writing a book. Now, David Warwick clearly ascribes to many of the same things that Chad Daybell does. And reading between the lines, knowing what I know about him, he had a conversion experience. And as a result of that conversion experience to the LDS faith, he believes that he routinely has visions, and those visions are often prophecies. So he believes that God is speaking prophecy to him through his dreams and visions. So that is the reason why Chad Daybell was so interested in publishing a book that he would write. So in the fall of 2015, David Warwick was invited to a conference in Rexburg. Now, remember, Rexburg has very high LDS population. Somewhere around 95% of the population within the city of Rexburg are members of the LDS Church. And BYU, Idaho, the Idaho campus of Brigham Young University, is located in Rexburg. As a result of that, it is a very popular place for conferences and all sorts of educational programs to be put on. Not just the doomsday folks, but a lot of folks have conferences in Rexburg. So David Warwick was invited to a conference in Rexburg. And I don't remember the name of the conference. It wasn't associated with preparing a people. But he was invited by someone named John Miller. And when he was asked about other people who were invited to this conference, he named Hector Sosa, Larry Hilton, and Tom Harrison. Now, those of you who've been following the channel for a while know Tom Harrison is the Spencer who had the visions in Visions of Glory. And so it's interesting that back in 2015, now Visions of Glory came out in 2012. And shortly following that, Tom Harrison had started sort of distancing himself from that in return for being able to remain within the LDS Church. But in 2015, Visions of Glory had already become very popular. Visions of Glory is the most purchased book, is the #1 purchased book in Utah, according to 2023 statistics. So it has a huge following. David Warwick was invited because he had done a few firesides and people had gotten to know him. While he was there, Chad Daybell invited him to come to his house because he wanted him to meet Julie Rowe. So David Warwick and several other people who were currently there for this conference went with Chad Daybell to his home and met Julie Rowe. They walked around on Chad's property, and Julie Rowe was telling everybody how the property was supposed to be laid out for when the tent city happened, where they were supposed to put a building. She was giving them all that information as they walked around on Chad Daybell's 4 acres. And so David Warwick met Julie Rowe. Julie was telling everybody where the tents should go. There were other people there, and he also met Tammy that day. Although she didn't participate, it seemed to him she wasn't very interested. But all these other people were hanging around. Now, at that point, 2015, they had already published Julie Rowe's book. The next conference where he saw Chad was in 2017. And his impression of Chad was that he was kind of kind and meek. Later on, he had a different impression of Chad, but at those times, that was his impression. The next time he met Chad was at Lori Vallow's house in Chandler in August of 2019, which very likely, that was right after Charles Vallow had died. He was with Melanie Gibb doing firesides in northern Arizona when Lori invited him to come and meet some people at her house. Chad was there, Lori Vallow was there, Alex Cox, Melanie Pulowski, Lori's niece, and someone named Julie, not Julie Rowe. They talked over lunch. They were talking about the gathering of the 144,000. They said Lori and Chad, said they were called to gather the 144,000 and talked about special gifts and their lives. The special gifts included power over the elements of the earth. Alex was the angel who came. They said they believed that Alex was the angel who came to stop Laman and Lemuel when Nephi was being smitten. And Alex Cox felt good that he was the good guy. David disagreed with Chad Daybell at that gathering and said so. David Warwick has consistently said that he did not agree with Chad Daybell. He believes that the end times are coming. He believes that the 144,000 are to be gathered. But he believes that when that call out comes, it will come from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints officials. It will come from the prophet of the church. It will not come from Chad Daybell or some other person who is not part of the church hierarchy, the 12 apostles, the prophet and his immediate helpers and people who are in the most powerful leadership of the church. Then he talked about when they were there in 2019, the weekend that JJ died. And he said that Chad was in and out during that time. Chad and Lori took, and this came out in Lori's trial too, and it's kind of almost laughable. Chad and Lori took them to a park next to a church, and it was a beautiful park. And David said, all he saw was a beautiful park, but they told him that they saw a multi-story building made of stone with arches. And they talked like they could see the building, but that David couldn't. And it seemed like they were saying, we can see this because we're the visionaries, and you can't see it because you're the non-believer. And that seemed to be a theme that sort of is run through their run-ins with then contact with David Warwick. It's very interesting because Melanie Gibb got divorced from her husband, whose name was also Brandon, and I'm sorry, it might be Brendan. Can't remember. There's a few of those in this case. But she got divorced from her husband. David Warwick was in the process of getting divorced when he and Melanie got together. That was a point that everybody brought out at trial. John Pryor was sort of gleeful in being able to point that out and point out to folks that, in fact, they were cheating on their respective spouses at the time. I want to point out that we have 700 people in our chat tonight. That's as many people, that's more people than we've had in quite a long time. So I want to say thanks for everybody that's here. Thanks for joining us tonight. If you have not hit subscribe, please do. Because it definitely helps with the algorithm. Please hit the thumbs up on your way in or out, because that also helps us a great deal. So thank you for everybody. I know it's Wednesday night and you could be sharing your Wednesday with in a lot of different ways. So I appreciate you all being here tonight. As I was saying, it was interesting that Lori and Chad were very adamant that their unmarried friends needed to get married. Melanie needed to get married right away. Zulema and Alex needed to get married right away because the tribulation was coming. And if you're not married, as we talked about earlier tonight, you don't get into the celestial kingdom. So I think it was very interesting that they did not push Melanie Gibb to get married, because I don't think they liked David Warwick and they didn't really want him in their inner circle along with Melanie. So they weren't as anxious for her to get married to David Warwick. She did get married to David Warwick, and now they've lived together for a very brief time and lived apart and in different states for much more of their marriage. Nobody really knows what that's about. David Warwick said that he was troubled by the fact that Lori and Chad seemed to be very intimate with one another, in spite of the fact that Chad was still married to Tammy. David Warwick asked Chad about Tammy, and he said, Tammy has been a good wife, and she's a great mom, and I just had this premonition for years. A lot of people made the point that he had said years before he met Lori that he thought Tammy was going to die young. But I've always known that Tammy was going to die young, and David Warwick said, how's her health? Is she sick? No, she's fine. So David Warwick had somehow along the way, there had been a discussion about there was 80 acres near Chad's home out in just outside. I keep wanting to call it Springville, and I think it is Springfield, but I'm not sure. It's just the outskirts of Rexburg. And there were 80 acres there for sale. Somehow along the way, David Warwick had said that he had a client. He's a building contractor. He had someone he knew that might be interested in building a development near Rexburg. And so Chad was very hot to take him to see this 80 acres. David Warwick kept sort of putting him off. They finally went out and looked at the property, but David Warwick was very clear, I don't do business on Sundays. And this was Sunday afternoon after church. The point was that Chad showed up still in his church clothes. David didn't go any further, even though Chad brought the realtor with him to try and talk to David about the possibility, because Chad saw that as a place for a white encampment once the tribulation started. That was where he wanted his tent city. So Chad Daybell suggested to David Warwick that David had a role in gathering the 144,000. And David said that type of call would come from a prophet and not from Chad, and that he knew his life was not in order for such a call. Interesting, because he was in between marriages. Monday morning, he described Lori as dramatic on that Monday morning. So Sunday night, they did the podcast together. Alex came in with JJ asleep on his shoulder, and JJ was never seen again. That Monday morning, when they got up, David said she was being dramatic. She seemed kind of wound up. She was talking fast and sort of described how JJ had been crawling around on the cabinets and above between the ceiling and the cabinets. And David thought that was odd because nothing was out of place. There were no scuff marks. There were no cabinets off the wall. And as David said, he's a builder, and he knows what would have happened if somebody had been crawling around up above those cabinets. The molding would have come off and some other things. So, and Lori said that JJ was having a possession attack. So clearly he was being possessed. Then we got into Pryor's cross-examination. One of the things that came up was an objection under Rule 610. Now, this is kind of interesting because this is not a typical rule of evidence in every state, but in Idaho it is. And you got to wonder if it has some origin in the higher religious population in general, because it is an evidence rule that says evidence of a witness's religious beliefs are not admissible to attack or support that person's credibility. So you cannot bring in religious beliefs solely for the purpose of saying this person is Catholic, so they're not credible, or this person is Mormon, so they're not credible. But religion does come up in instances where it is relevant to the case, and that clearly is here. He also made the point, I thought was very interesting, for two people who got together because of their religious beliefs. David Warwick pled ignorance in saying what Melanie did when she taught classes, what she said, what she believed. He did talk about the fact that she does reflexology, which is definitely related to energy work. And energy work is sort of a little bit more on the metaphysical level and is something that the LDS Church discourages. This idea of muscle testing and energy work and Reiki and some of those other disciplines that deal with bodily and energy are not something that is encouraged by the mainstream church, but it is very popular within the church. Today we heard from Brenda Dye. She was the coroner. I want to talk a little bit about medical examiners versus coroners, because I don't think that it's necessarily clearly understood. A coroner is an elected position, and it is generally someone who has some medical training, but is not a medical doctor. The coroner's job is to issue death certificates and to determine cause and manner of death. So Brenda Dye was dispatched to, the coroner is dispatched anytime there is an unattended death. That is one that is not attended by medical personnel. And their responsibility is to investigate the manner and cause of death. So Brenda Dye came, she put her hand on Tammy's abdomen. It was cold to the touch. The abdomen is usually the last place to lose, the core is the last place to lose body heat. And so it's somewhat, I mean, all of these things that establish time of death are pretty inaccurate. So rigor mortis, lividity, body temperature, those things, because they can be impacted by external forces as well. But all of those things pointed to the fact that Tammy Daybell had been dead for several hours by the time medical personnel responded. So initially, she determined that Tammy had died of natural causes. Later, after the medical examiner, after law enforcement got a court order to exhume Tammy's body, and the medical examiner performed an autopsy, she revised that death certificate. Now, John Pryor made a lot out of this, and he was pretty rough on her in particular, kind of bullied her. And that's unfortunate because she did everything that she was supposed to do. She initially certified the manner and cause of death as natural causes. Later on, when law enforcement got a court order to exhume Tammy's body, she went to the autopsy, was present when the autopsy was performed, and based on the medical examiner, who is a medical doctor, based on the medical examiner's report, revised her official government document that listed time, manner, and cause of death. So a medical examiner is a medical doctor, an MD who has a background in pathology. A coroner is an elected official who deals with the administrative duties surrounding death and death certificates. She's the person who signs every death certificate in the county. So for Fremont County, Brenda Dye was the elected, and still is the elected coroner. She is an EMT and it still works as an EMT, but she is not a medical doctor. So I thought that John Pryor was rougher on her than he really needed to be. And I felt that all that really did was tee up the prosecution for what's going to happen when they ask questions of the medical examiner, because I think he sort of telegraphed his hand in a way that I might not have done. The other witnesses that were called today, for the most part, were people who knew Tammy Daybell. There were several people who had worked with her and were in her clogging class and were in this high intensity fitness class that she took. And I thought it was unfortunate that some of what John Pryor did was a little bit over the top in terms of saying, well, Tammy wasn't a paragon of fitness. She wasn't slender. She wasn't, and the women who testified were very clear that they thought that Tammy was very energetic, that she was in very good shape, and that she and Emma, in fact, had been training to run a 5K. There's been a lot of talk about that she was training to run a marathon, and that was not true at all. A marathon is much, much longer. I think it's 126.2. No, that's 26.2 miles, and it's many, many more kilometers. So a 5K is about 3 miles, and she was training to run that. She and Emma were training together to run that. But they were both very clear that they thought that she was in good physical shape, and they didn't have any concerns about her health. She didn't show any sign of being overly fatigued or having any kind of problem completing that exercise. The last witness today was Detective Bruce Mattingly. He was the person who was dispatched when Detective Kayakamanu was on last. Bruce Mattingly was dispatched when Lieutenant Kayakamanu couldn't be reached. He actually was on a call in Idaho City assisting with an officer-involved shooting. And so they contacted Detective Mattingly instead. And Officer Kayakamanu was on the stand to continue to talk about Tammy's unaccompanied death. It's very clear that John Pryor is very interested in going after Melanie Gibb and David Warwick as to their involvement on the evening of the shootings. The other two people who appeared this week were Lori's son, Colby, and Melanie Boudreau's ex-husband, Brandon Boudreau. So Colby was called. A lot of folks asked why they didn't play the jail call between Colby and Lori that they played at Lori's trial. The reason is because it would have drawn a relevance challenge, and certainly is more prejudicial than probative as it applies to Chad, because it's not a conversation between Chad and anybody. It's a conversation between Colby and his mother, and as such really doesn't have direct relevance to Chad's guilt or innocence. So that's why it didn't get played. Colby talked at length about his mom and the changes that he saw. He talked at length about his relationship with Charles. He listed, when he was asked who his family members were, he included Charles's two sons as his brothers, and later explained that they were his stepbrothers. He choked up when he was, as is completely understandable, when he identified photographs of Tylee and JJ. And I think probably the most significant thing he said was, in terms of being pointed with the jury and is coming back. And I'll tell you what, if I were the prosecution, this would have big stars all over it as something to bring up in my closing argument. Because what happens when you are putting on a case is, as you are going through, I marked or used a highlighter or had a symbol I used to mark points that I wanted to bring up in closing that were good points that came out during the examination, especially during cross. And so this little nugget, I thought, was really huge for the prosecution, because Colby was asked whether he believed that Chad Daybell had influenced his mother, and drew a big objection and from John Pryor. The court overruled it, and Colby said he 100% believed his mother was influenced by Chad Daybell. So that is going to be a big deal. Now, when Brandon Boudreaux was called, it was very hard for him to talk about the kids. He talked about his relationship with the children, his son's relationship with, and his son is named Braxton, just like Lori and Lori's cousin Braxton. He brought up that his son and JJ were close, that his son always went out of his way. His son's a couple of years older, always really went out of his way to include JJ. And he also got much deeper into the attempt on his life. He talked a lot about what happened, how it happened, what he observed. And I'm sure that that will get connected up with more about Alex Cox and about the Jeep. He was able to positively identify the Jeep as Tylee's Jeep that she drove before she died, with the Texas license plates on it. He was very clearly able to identify the Jeep, and he was able to, he also talked quite a bit about his relationship with Melanie and Lori's role in alienating Melanie from him, and Lori's role in the basis of their divorce. So he talked about the fact that Melanie claimed that she was divorcing him because Aunt Lori told her that he hacked her computer, and Aunt Lori told her that he was gay. And he delved into that. And so I think overall the prosecution is doing a good job of painting Chad as this person who had this influence over this group of people. They've done a very good job of coming back, especially with Melanie Gibb. Who told you that? Lori Vallow. Where did Lori Vallow find out? She found out from Chad. Who told you that? Now, we are, I'm certain, going to hear from Zulema, because Zulema had a much closer relationship with Chad. And I think the prosecution is going to bring Zulema in to talk in depth about the influence that Chad had directly on Zulema. For Melanie Gibb, it was much more, Lori would talk to Chad and then she would relay what Chad told her to Melanie. At one point, Melanie was asked, did you believe this? And she kind of said, yeah, mostly. She did sort of pull her punch and say, you know, never 100%. But she had to admit that, yes, she believed it. So I think when we get Zulema on the stand, the prosecution is going to keep hammering home that it was Chad who had all these ideas and was bringing them to this small group of followers. So that will be interesting to see, because that's where we're going to see more of the direct Chad influenced me to believe this way. We haven't seen that yet, but I think that's coming. So there are, the prosecution still has 3 weeks of witnesses potentially. We don't know where that's going to go. We know that we haven't seen Zulema. We know that we haven't seen any of the FBI experts or the medical examiners. So there's a lot of experts still to come from the FBI and some of those. And we haven't seen any of the phone location information. We've seen the extractions that included the text messages and all of that stuff, but we have not seen any of the GPS location data. And that is going to take some time. We know that it took the better part of a day. In Lori's case, we don't even have any idea how much information they're going to bring out when it comes to Chad, because what we saw of Chad's location data was really just during as it related to Chad, or as it related to Alex and Lori. And really the only thing we saw was right around the time of the children, that the children were buried in Chad's yard. That's the only time we saw much in the way of location data for Chad. So we've still got a lot of ground to cover, and a lot of it is going to be in the weeds. So I think the prosecution has done a good job of teeing up those experts by giving the jury some of the juicy stuff and a good overview of the case, so that when we do get to the point where we're talking about the minutia of the technical data, it's going to give them some hooks to hang things on. So remember that a circumstantial case is like a chain, and every piece of evidence is a link in the chain. And the more the prosecution can do to link those links together, the better, the more complete their case is going to be, and the better likelihood that the jury is going to be able to come to an understanding based on that circumstantial evidence. So it's not that that chain doesn't have any missing links, because they always will. But the question is, can the jury infer information from this link and this link that connects this one? And if there are too many of those gaps, then the jury is not going to be able to put that whole puzzle together. I always say about circumstantial evidence, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. And so if you have a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle, and it is a flower garden, and you've got this piece that's missing, and you can tell that the area that piece is missing from is a bunch of daffodils, you can logically assume that that piece would also have daffodils on it. However, if that piece is off in a corner somewhere, and it's kind of a brown, around sort of a brown blob, and you've got enough pieces missing that you're not sure what that brown blob is. It could be the flower bed, or it could be a dog. You don't know, because you can't tell from there's too many pieces missing. So the jigsaw puzzle, if you can reasonably assume what fits in that hole, then you can make that inference. But if you think, okay, well, if I fill in this piece, I still can't tell if that's a dog, or maybe it's a cow, or maybe it's just dirt. So that's what the prosecution's up against. I think they're doing a pretty good job of connecting up enough that the jury can start to make those reasonable inferences. So, but we're not there yet. We still have a lot of witnesses to come. We do know that John Pryor has been releasing people from his subpoenas, so he may not have as many witnesses as he projected. But he's already told the court that he has 7 expert witnesses. Now, we don't know what those experts are, but I suspect some of them are going to be attacking the science surrounding some of these processes. I'm sure he's going to have a DNA expert, and I'm sure that he's probably going to have somebody who's going to be talking about GPS location. One of the questions that is coming up a lot in criminal defense is this issue of pseudoscience or junk science. And so things that were established to be scientific are now being challenged as being overly subjective. For instance, we talked at length about the bullets and the ballistics in Delphi, and the fact that what they've linked to Richard Allen is an unfired cartridge. And that is a very different analysis than something that's been fired through the barrel of a gun. There's a lot of question about the scientific reliability of tool marks on an unspent cartridge. One of the things that has developed in recent years, in recent like maybe 3 to 5 years, is what the FBI calls CAST. I don't remember what it stands for, but it is cell tower and GPS location information, and it is the same raw data that they get from GPS and cell towers, but it has a completely different mathematical analysis applied to it. So now the math geniuses, which I am not one of, are asking questions about whether or not that way of mathematically analyzing that data is reliable. Because what it did was it narrowed the area that they could reasonably place a device from blocks to feet. And so now a lot of people have a lot of questions about how they reached that conclusion. And there are a lot of challenges going on to CAST data. So I have talked for an hour and a half. I have virtually no voice left, and it's time to take questions. While we do that, don't forget that we are still looking for folded crane squares, quilt squares to be done for a quilt for the Woodcocks, Larry and Kay. So there is a link in our description below that takes you to the pattern. The pattern should finish at 6 inches and should have a black background. You can choose any design, any color, any print for the actual crane itself. Thank you. There is a tradition in Japan that when someone passes, you fold 1,000 cranes in memory of that person. So it seemed like an appropriate design to do a quilt for Kay and Larry. Someone asked me whether or not I could do a tutorial. Unfortunately, all my quilting stuff is packed, getting ready to and put away so that we're decluttered for house showing. So I don't have the ability to do that. Now, when we did our quilt along, our True Crime Quilt Guild, in those videos, there was a link to the woman who designed that pattern. She had a link to some instructional videos, and that one included a foundation piecing instructional video. Now, I know that for those of you who are quilters, Alex Anderson has a great, I'm going to get to that question in just one second. Alex Anderson has a great series on foundation piecing. For those of you who are familiar, she's a well-known quilter and quilt designer. She's got a lot of foundation piecing tutorials. So if you're having trouble with the design, or you're not familiar with foundation piecing, please do a little search on YouTube, and I'm sure you'll find lots of instructional videos. I wish I could do it, but I can't break out those boxes right now. So on to questions. Thank you, Tiff. Cellular Analysis Survey Team, thank you. There are times by Wednesday night that I just can't pull up those details. The gray matter who's storing that, or I've gone to bed already. So, and it doesn't help that I'm taking all kinds of allergy meds. 7 gatherers, Chad, Lori, Mel P. Yeah, I have seen this. Harvard lawyer Lee was talking about speculating about who those people could be. Chad, Lori, Melanie Pulowski, Melanie Gibb, Zulema Pastenis, Alex, and maybe Jason Mao. I don't know. I mean, there are certainly some other players. Could be David Warwick. It could be, I mean, you know, you could speculate on who would be the 7 gatherers if it is their own internal group. I think we're going to hear more about it because I think that John Pryor is very interested in that. He planted those seeds for a reason, so we're going to hear more about it. So, but good guess. I think we could. I think we could fill in the roster with a couple of maybes. So, and I'm really sorry for the gravel voice. You just, well, have to bear with me. So, Denicia Rose, howdy. You know who we haven't heard about tonight? Trisha the trucker. I hope she's with us. And well, it's always great to hear where she is. Denicia, in Idaho, if someone has immunity, does it have to be disclosed? I can't find any info for Idaho versus other states, whether it's a clear yes or no. I don't believe that they have to disclose if someone has immunity. It, I think, oh gosh, now you're asking me to tap into my memory banks. I believe it did come up in Lori's case. And, you know, prosecutors often bring it up because they know that the state's going to bring it up, or the defense is going to bring it up. So we do know, because it got out there in the public domain, that Zulema has immunity. She's the only one that we've identified. The reason we know that is because Rob Wood went down to Arizona and was involved in interviews of Summer Shiflett, Lori's sister, Zulema, and I think he was also involved in some of the at least talking to law enforcement about Melanie Gibb. But when Zulema's attorney came in with her to have those conversations, he recorded the conversation he had with Rob Wood. And Rob Wood, in that recording, said that Zulema had immunity. So we know that one because that one got out. We do not know about Melanie Gibb. I have speculated 7 ways from Sunday that she has some sort of immunity. I think it came out during her testimony and prior to her testimony that she exchanged somewhere around 320 text messages with the prosecution. And there is no way around the fact that that is a ridiculous number of text messages for the prosecution to be exchanging with their witnesses. That smacks of way more than witness preparation. That smacks of witness coaching. And I guarantee that you are going to see John Pryor go way down that rabbit hole. So 744 people we have in the chat. Thank you so much. Hit subscribe and the like button, please. Carrie, I'm incredibly frustrated with the prosecution. Interesting. I actually think that they have done as good or not, and a couple of them I think have done better than they did the first time. I will say I think Rob Wood's as good as he was last time. I think that Lindsay Blake has really has done much better this time. Now, you have to preface this by saying that the first week of testimony, her father died very suddenly, and I sympathize beyond belief with her and the way that she came right back and went right back to work and stayed focused and was able to maintain her focus in spite of that, because that is tough. And I think that she has definitely honed her delivery and honed her questions as compared to last time. But I would say I think there have been some missed opportunities on the part of the prosecution. And I don't know if those are tactical decisions or whether they're simply not being able to see the forest for the trees. You know, sometimes we get so deeply into a case and so far into the weeds that we're really not able to get that 30,000 foot view. And that could be the case too. I don't know. But Carrie, I would be interested to know what it is about the prosecution that's gotten you frustrated. So if you want to sort of post a little bit more and we can talk about that, I'm happy to do that. So thanks. As therapists say more about that. If you ever listen to Esther Perel, who has a fabulous podcast, that's one of the things she says often. Say more about that. Hi, Greg W. What do you think about Pryor and Chad body shaming Tammy after her death? I think it's disgraceful. I think it was really uncalled for. I don't think that, and I think this points up John Pryor's age and his mindset. We've all talked about the fact that John Pryor is a man of a certain age, and as such, he has some attitudes that I think are sort of a little old-fashioned, might I even say Neanderthal. And I think those came out when he started talking about Tammy. I think it was super unnecessary. I think that he could have said, are you really sure that she was in that good a shape? Or, he could have gone about it some other way than to say, yeah, but she was just sort of a dumpy housewife. I don't think that was called for. And I certainly, I worry that the jury is going to see that and go, we're liking John Pryor less and less. But you go there at your own peril. So if the jury looks at John Pryor and says, hey, John, you just stuck your foot in it, that's going to be his own fault for stepping into that, and so unnecessarily. So that's a really good question, Greg, and I'm glad you asked it because I didn't bring it up in our conversation earlier in the recap. Yeah, my misogyny much. Yeah. I have to say I started practicing in 1992. So these were some of the people who were already lawyers at the time that I started practicing. I definitely, I can tell you over the years, both defense and prosecution alike, I met male lawyers of that generation, that yuppie generation, the 80s, late 70s, 80s yuppie generation, who still have those really firmly misogynistic kinds of viewpoints. And it was like swimming upstream sometimes to be a woman in that environment. I was lucky that having been in the military, I was pretty practiced at it. But I can tell you that that over time it seemed to improve, but not nearly as quickly as it needed to. And so I think it was very unfortunate for John Pryor to go there. And I think it showed a little bit about his character to the jury that I don't think they're going to be real sympathetic to. So, yeah. So sorry, I'm getting downright gravelly. Retired RN 43. I know who that is. Why is the last detective not subject to the same rules of discussion of the case as the others? Oh, I understand what you're saying. This is Kaya Kamano is his name. And it is spelled really complicatedly. He is a Pacific Islander, and I think his first name is Vince, Kaya Kamanu. The reason the judge made that comment when Kaya Kamanu got on the stand and he said, I don't have to ask you all those same questions, is because the prosecution is entitled to name a lead investigator who is their person in the courtroom, and that has been Vince Kayakamanu. In Lori's case, it was Ray Hermosillo, but Kayakamanu has been the guy who's in the courtroom, and he's kind of in the for the defense is entitled to have an investigator there who's the person who is sort of their backstop, knowing the whole case and being able to provide some investigative support. So John Pryor's investigator is there. He sits in the front row right behind John. So Kayakamanu is that person who's been designated by the prosecution. So it's the same issue of he can be in the courtroom the whole time. He doesn't have to avoid watching the live stream. He can be in there the same as Kay and Larry can be in there because they're representatives of the victims. So that was the reason why the judge said he didn't have to go through that whole colloquy of asking him, have you watched any of the live stream? Have you talked to anybody who's previously testified, any of those things? Because he's exempt from those questions. So that good question though. You know, sometimes when that happens, I forget that y'all aren't quite as fluent in courtroom as I am, because when it happened, I was like, oh yeah, I get that. And I glossed right over it. So I'm glad when you guys bring these questions up, because I don't think to explain them. So, and you know, we're kind of past all the simple questions. You guys ask the more complex questions. So way to go, guys. So go Dana Good Lori. Please answer my question. I don't recall if Chad's original DL list that he, that he emailed to Lori, which Charles forwarded to the family, was presented as evidence at Lori's trial. It was presented as evidence. His light and dark scale, as well as his death percentages, were all presented at Lori's trial. They were in an email. I think the email may have even been the one that Charles forwarded to Tammy. But so it was kind of a multi-page document, but it was offered in Lori's case as well. And that was a very poignant list. If you looked at the people who were dark and the people who were light, and you know, that was a hard list to look at, knowing what we know now. So, and thank you, Jen, for catching that. I think that question came from our Good Lori Facebook group. If you don't belong, be sure and join. And we try and catch questions when they come from that group as well. So. Jody Buchmeyer, what do you think the jury is thinking? Oof, man, if I could tell you what juries were thinking, I would still be practicing. Or I would be a jury consultant and be making that big money like that guy from New York made on the Adelson case. I'm here to tell you, it is difficult to know what a jury is thinking. What I can say is what I said earlier. Lori Vallow's jury were much more transparent in their expressions and in the emotions that they showed, in their body language, much more transparent. This jury is a little harder to read, and I think that they are doing their best to process the information that's coming into them. And remember, you and I have been following this case for 4 years, and we have had 4 years to absorb this information. They are literally drinking from a fire hose, and they're having to absorb that information in huge amounts. And so it's a little hard to read them. I think that they are earnest. They look very engaged. And when I see them, I don't ever see any of them looking off into space. I don't see them looking like they're not attentive. I see lots of them making notes. This time they've given them a portfolio that has a cover on it, and I see them very, very scrupulously. There's at least one juror that I'm sure is some sort of an administrative person because she's furiously taking notes all the time. I'm certain that's going to come in handy in deliberations. So I think it's really hard to tell with this group. I was much more certain about what Lori's jury was thinking than I am about this group. Um, I have seen some sort of passing, fleeting kinds of expressions when John Pryor has been doing cross examination, but they don't necessarily look like annoyance. They look sort of like fleeting, um, more questioning, like when he does some of his like antics, it's a little bit more like, really? Not really annoyance as much. We definitely saw that in Lori's case, that those folks, you saw the disgust and the annoyance on their faces. I don't see that as much with this group, but I do sort of every once in a while see sort of a fleeting, really, sort of an expression. Um, but this one, it's tough. I don't know that we're. I am not as sorry. I just had to check to make sure I wasn't getting incoming text messages that were important to our screen to our stream. This one, I would say, I am not nearly as confident as I felt during Lori's. Having been able to watch the jury, I was pretty confident what the verdict was going to be. That and the fact that there was very little defense, but having watched her jurors, I felt pretty sure I knew what the outcome was going to be for her. I cannot say that with this jury. So we're all going to be on verdict watch, on pins and needles. I mean, that could change. The dynamic of a jury changes over time, and especially in a case with this long. Now, they're not allowed to discuss the case among one another, amongst themselves, which means that when they're together, they're having many more conversations and getting to know one another. And there's a certain amount of bonding. The jurors who were on Lori's case talked about how bonded they were by the end of the case, and so the level of their bond can impact the way the jury is receiving information, even though they're not allowed to talk about it. So there's an evolution going on in the jury as well, and that could change going by the time we get to the end of the trial. It also could change because they could get fed up with John Pryor's antics. It could go from really to you have got to be kidding me, and that could happen. And if it does, it's going to be John Pryor's own darn fault for it. So those are really good questions, and the answer is I don't know for sure. Even somebody who is a practiced courtroom observer, I think would have a little trouble reading this jury. We have time for a few more questions. Canuck 23. Does this mean he may have been contemplating murdering her before he met Lori? He was trying to pick up women before Lori. I don't know. That is tough to say. We do know that I think that we can surmise that he was, at a minimum, bored and very likely unhappy in his marriage, finding it unfulfilling. And we do know that there has been substantial discussion, including from some people who are in the know, about his relationship with Julie Rowe. So I think it's possible that I think it's possible that what may have been in his mind wishful thinking became acting out his fantasies and his wishful thinking. I don't know that we can say for certain that he was contemplating murdering Tammy before he met Lori, but certainly once he met Lori, that was the galvanizing incident. I mean, um, that certainly galvanized his desire not to be married to Tammy anymore. And that coupled with his seeming belief that Jesus would be unhappy with him if he divorced Tammy, I think was the tipping point. But you're right. Things that make you go, Hi, Lemon Drop. I was in the courtroom yesterday, wasn't in the courtroom today. And I did see um, that little move. And I'm not utterly convinced that Chad was all that broken up. But John Pryor passed him the Kleenex, which I think was the move. And I think that's something that John Pryor will continue to do every time he thinks Chad should be emotional about something that comes up in court. I didn't necessarily see a tear, and I didn't hear a lot of sniffling afterwards. I was sitting about 3 rows back from in the gallery, and had a fairly clear side view of Chad. And although John Pryor is sometimes in the way when you're looking at Chad, but a fairly clear view of him. And I didn't really hear or see anything until Pryor handed him the Kleenexes, and then suddenly it was, and I have heard from that council table when Lori cried, plenty of sniffling and snuffing, and I did not hear that coming from Chad. So I think at a minimum it was dramatized. If there were any tears, it was a lot more was made of it than for real. And I think that tracks with his behavior when Tammy died. I mean, the hysteria was ridiculous. The hysteria on the phone, and then the officers going on about how hysterical he was. And I think that it was definitely overplayed. So, good question. I won't be back in the courtroom this week because I have my little old mama I need to take her to a couple of appointments this week. So I will not be back in the courtroom. I will be, of course, following it by live stream. But my mama needs to go to a couple of appointments. So, and I wanted to point out that the judge did say that there won't be court. Hang on, I got to find where I wrote that down. Next Tuesday, I believe. Things, as I said, the prosecution seems to be cooking along pretty quickly, and they had asked for some extra time. So I think it's Tuesday. There won't be any court on Tuesday. I will be back in the courthouse. I'm trying to get there every other day or so because I think that you still get a lot out of being there to see the jury and to feel the environment. So I'm going to keep going. It's important that I'm there, but I can't be there every day. And I've got to tell you, the traffic getting into Boise I live in Meridian, which is a little suburb of Boise. And I'm telling you, the traffic just gets worse going into rush hour traffic going into town every day. SM wants to know, please, Pryor subpoenaed Heather Daybell. Can the state call her if Pryor doesn't? I don't know whether the state has subpoenaed Heather Daybell, and I actually don't know for sure if she has been subpoenaed, but if she has, um, prior, the state could call her. They could call her on rebuttal, I suppose, if Pryor doesn't call her. Um, I I don't know if you have seen the interview that she did with Lauren Matthias. Uh, I mean, she has some interesting things to say. I've interviewed Heather, and she has some interesting things to say about Chad and his behavior in Rexburg, but I'm not certain that a lot of it has a direct connection that would connect up the chain to the deaths, to the children and to Tammy. The most direct thing I think I can recall is her saying that they went on a family trip. Chad and Tammy were there, and Tammy didn't come out of the hotel room. She was depressed and didn't want to be around anybody. And I think if you put those dates together, that is likely right around the time that Charles Vallow emailed Tammy about Chad and Lori's affair. So that's something maybe she could testify to, but I think the issue of the influence that Chad had over Lori and over his followers, that's not necessarily something I think Heather can testify to. So I don't know why John Pryor uh, subpoenaed her if he did, and I don't know. I don't know what that's all about. Sometimes lawyers subpoena by shotgun, and that's that they subpoena everybody in under the sun that they could possibly think that they might call, only because it's very difficult to subpoena someone later. So for example, if something were to come up in the prosecution's case that Heather Daybell could support or refute, then he might want her subject to a subpoena so that he could get her there really quickly. Um, and I've done it before. It's really hard to subpoena someone in the middle of your case and get them there in time to make the point that you wanted to make. It's much easier to subpoena everybody possible and then tell people later, I don't need you, I don't need you. So that's that's may very well be why he's got her under subpoena, but um, I'm not sure that she adds a lot to the story from the how did Chad influence people to do his bidding um, point. So good questions. We've got time for a couple more before we wrap up. Dr. Von Kay. During the hearing that was held after court was dismissed today, Annie, and JJK were formally assigned by Judge Boyce personal representatives. Tammy was not. Do you know why? Yeah, actually, I do know why. It really isn't personal representative. What it means is that person can remain in the courtroom as the representative for the victim, and they don't have to be excluded even if they're later going to be called as witnesses. So it also means that they can give victim impact statements even though they are not direct blood relatives. So the reason why Tammy wasn't officially is because her sister's already been in the courtroom. That's Samantha Gwillem, and she has been in the courtroom the whole time. Apparently, it wasn't necessary to make that official. For Tylee, Annie Cushing is going to be her representative, and of course, Kay for JJ. So And Kay comes in, Kay came in not only because she was JJ's grandmother, but because she was Charles's sister. And Charles wasn't available to be JJ's representative of his victims. So these are great questions, guys. Let's see if we can take a couple more before we wrap it up. Hey, tennis girl. If the jury determines Tammy died naturally, can Chad be convicted of conspiracy? No. I mean, if the jury were to say, we don't believe that Tammy was murdered, she died of natural causes, then I don't believe that Chad can be found guilty of conspiracy. Now, conspiracy to commit murder is a separate crime from murder. Conspiracy to commit murder is planning with at least one other person to commit a crime. That's conspiracy. And at least one of those people takes a substantial step toward accomplishing the crime. But I think that if the jury were to find that that Tammy died of natural causes and that Chad was not the cause of her death, then there's no way he could be convicted of conspiring to murder her. He could still be convicted for conspiracy to commit the murder of the children. But there has to have been a murder before there could be a conspiracy to commit one. Good question, though. I mean, the law is not always 100% logical, but in that regard, I think so. Okay, last question. Lemon drop. If Chad has life insurance and he gets the death penalty, does the policy pay out? Wow, that's a good question. I think it depends on the terms, the actual terms of the policy, but possibly. If it is not specifically exempted within the policy, it really depends. Insurance, we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about whether the insurance company could, the payout for Tammy could be recovered by the insurance company. An insurance policy is a contract that you make between you, the person whose life is insured, and the company. And the company, I mean, it's sort of a little bit of a roulette game because they're betting you're going to die and you're betting you aren't, or vice versa. You're betting you are going to die and they're betting you're not. So, it is a commercial transaction done by contract. So the terms of the contract, that the policy that Chad has with that insurer, is what controls. So if the policy says that they don't pay out if your death is caused because of the death penalty, then it would be exempt. But otherwise, probably would be covered, and his kids probably would inherit his life insurance. Whoever the beneficiary is, I'm assuming it's his kids. So. Well, I want to say thank you to everybody who's here tonight. 700, I think we were up in the 770s at one time, folks with us tonight, and I so appreciate that. I know that there are a lot more important things, there are more fun things that you could be doing with your Wednesday night. So I appreciate it when you decide to spend it with us. As always, I want to thank Jen, our moderator, for doing a fabulous job like she always does. And I also want to thank all of you for joining us. I'm going to try and do an update on Saturday, depending on how the trial goes, and we'll check, but watch for a surprise live. Those are usually shorter, only about an hour, and I'm trying to do them at a little bit different times so that folks who don't usually get the chance to pop in live have the opportunity to. So look for that hopefully on Saturday. Don't forget CrimeCon. I just saw that in the chat. Don't forget that it starts May 30th through June 1st in Nashville. They do use volunteers and they do give out passes. If you're all in the area and want to come and hang out and volunteer a little, you get a staff t-shirt and a pass. So think about that too. Those links are all in our show notes, so you can find them there. Thanks again for joining us. I'm going to take my froggy voice and have a little hot toddy. So I want to say thanks again, and I will chat with you all probably on Saturday. Have a great week. Have a great weekend, and take care, everybody. Good night.